We're going to move on to another fantasist. President Vladimir Putin has publicly approved the evacuation of civilians from parts of southern Ukraine, saying the population should not be made to suffer. The announcement was made during the Unity Day holiday in Moscow's Red Square and comes after 15,000 civilian casualties have already been recorded since Russia invaded Ukraine earlier this year. Well, joining us now for an update is war professor and NATO historian Dr. Peter Caddick-Adams. Thank you very much, Dr. Caddick-Adams, for joining us today. Well, President Zelensky of Ukraine has accused Iran of lying and of supporting Russia. Just bring us up to date with what's happening in Ukraine at present.
Yes, I mean, this is one of the latest twists and turns. We've known for a long time that Iran has been sending drones that are capable of carrying quite a lot of high explosive to Russia. And Russia has been using those in the attacks on the civilian infrastructure throughout the country. And these are things that will travel for 1,500 miles. They'll take 100 pounds of explosives. So they're not tiny little drones that we might think of in this country. And Iran has been denying supplying these to Russia for a long, long time. And then all of a sudden, they've suddenly admitted that they supplied a few a long time before the crisis kicked off, which frankly, is beyond credibility. So they've been caught out lying. And then, like a school child, they sort of reinvent the truth. So that's just one of the twists and turns of this particular week in this ongoing crisis. I mean, it's been going on now for over 250 days. Incredible, because most of us, I think, would have written Ukraine off in the first week, and yet they have risen to nationhood in a way that no one would have ever thought possible.
Indeed, and we often talk about what's happening on the military front, but it's very interesting to read around the amount of civilians who have lost their lives, Peter, during this dreadful, dreadful campaign.
Yeah, I mean, on both sides, of course, we have to remember that this was a war that started back in 2014, and the latest iteration just began this February when the sort of ante was completely upped by the Russians, by Vladimir Putin. But the real losers, the people, the civilians caught in the middle. Some of those are of Russian ethnicity, but the vast majority are Ukrainian, who really don't want to have to choose and have got caught. And of course, it took us a long time to realize that Russia went into this war with a cultural agenda, which was to destroy Ukraine's culture. And they've been evacuating huge numbers of Ukrainians against their will into Mother Russia, dumping them anywhere, and particularly children. And just trying to sort of reorganize Russia and Ukraine in a way that sort of Stalin would have done in the Second World War and in the 1950s.
Yeah. Paul, you have a question?
Peter, I'd be interested in your opinion. To what extent do you think the West does have to bear some responsibility for the current situation within Ukraine? And I don't say that in any way as a supporter of Putin's invasion, which I think is appalling. But nonetheless, I mean, you mentioned 2014. That was, of course, when an elected leader of Ukraine, Yanukovych, was overthrown in a coup, large elements of which were part of a fascist mob, aided and abetted by the EU, aided and abetted by the Americans and other governments in the West. And that's led, in part at least, to the current situation, hasn't it? Where, because Yanukovych was someone who was looking east rather than ramping up things in terms of carrying out military operations on Russia's borders. The truth is, you don't have to be a supporter of Putin to be uneasy at some of that and to say, perhaps we should look in the mirror at what
completely take issue with you. I completely take issue with you there, because, I mean, your version of what's going on in Ukraine is Alice in Wonderland to me and to a lot of other Ukrainians. Yanukovych was a Russian plant. He was totally hand in glove to Putin and always had been. And his mission all along was to make let me finish. Was to make sure that Ukraine ended up in Russia's pocket rather than in Western Europe. And the choice was always east or west. It was either Brussels or Moscow. And Yanukovych was on the verge of delivering that. And Russia deployed snipers to Kiev to kill the demonstrators on the streets. And Yanukovych was overthrown by a popular uprising, nothing to do with the West. And the more, I mean, you are playing the role so often that people are
it's just not true.
Aiding the Russian narrative, even just by confusion and disinformation.
What you're saying, Peter,
but let's forget that for the moment.
What you're saying
the
is
real
simply
story
not
here
true. What you're saying is simply not true. When you say Peter, that the West had no involvement in the coup in 2014, is simply not true. There is a wealth of evidence to show that the Americans were involved in the overthrow of the coup, that the EU was supportive of the overthrow of Yanukovych and the coup. Simply saying to us, well, it's just not true that the West was involved, is a denial of history. You must know that.
Peter.
Right, okay, all right. So have you been to Ukraine? Have you spoken to people on the streets? Because I have. I've been to Ukraine most years. I've been up to the front lines. I've got the mood of the people. I understood it before the uprising and certainly afterwards. And that first-hand knowledge, I think, will give anyone a real understanding that there is a lot of Russian meddling in Eastern Europe, and there always has been. And this is nothing to do with a Western globalist plot
doesn't allow you to rewrite history
from anyone else.
It does. I'm saying to you, Peter, the fact that you've been to Ukraine and spoken to people, and I don't doubt that, it doesn't allow you to rewrite history. The truth is that in 2014, an elected leader of Ukraine who wanted to build relations with Russia and not so much the EU and the West was overthrown, and he was overthrown by a mob, elements of which were unquestionably fascist and were aided and abetted by the West. Now, you can oppose Putin's invasion, which I do wholeheartedly, but accept that we've got to have an honest appraisal of history, and it seems to me that you're not interested in doing that, frankly.
I'm a professional historian. I'm a NATO historian, and history has been my life. And studying what's going on in Eastern Europe is something I've been doing for 30 years. And before that, I used to go to Moscow in Cold War days. So I think you're on very thin ground if you're accusing me of falsifying history. I think it's very easy for people in the West who have little knowledge of what's been going on in the East, the traditional pressures coming from Russia, the feeling that many East European countries have, not just Ukraine, but places like Georgia, the Poles, the three Baltic states, of an enemy at the gates that's been increasingly aggressive under Vladimir Putin, and not just going back to 2014, going back to 1999, when Vladimir Putin first came to power, in a speech that he gave in 2006 in Munich, saying, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to roll back the frontiers because this is all a Western plot. And so if we start taking events in isolation, we can start to easily turn around and say there's something fishy, there's a Western plot. But if you look at the bigger picture, you suddenly realize there's been a rolling agenda that's been laid out by Vladimir Putin for a long, long time. And this is just the latest iteration of that. And given that his background is KGB and he's very good at disinformation, then we must make sure that we're not part of that. Now, I mean, another story that came out this week was that Vladimir Putin suddenly turned around and said, I've never threatened nuclear war. And this was a speech that he gave to some of his colleagues from his supporting nations. And he's absolutely right. I went back through all his speeches, and even on the 24th of February, when he made when the invasion was first announced, all he ever said was the consequences will be beyond your comprehension. They'll be too difficult to imagine. And Peter, every single speech
I'm afraid
that he's made
Peter, I'm
has
sorry,
never
we've run out of
mentioned
time,
nuclear
we're going to have to move
on. And what
on.
he's doing is he's giving us disinformation. This is a bit like George Orwell's Room 101. He's letting our own fears take a hold of us.
Peter,
and that's been
I could listen to you all day about this particular man and his fantasies and all the rest of it, but thank you for joining us. Unfortunately, we've ran completely out of time. That's Dr. Peter Caddick-Adams, who has joined us to talk about the war in Ukraine. But coming up after the break,